just to help me get an idea of quite how gentle I need to be with scientific background. How many of you have ever studied biology beyond GCSE level? How many of you have ever studied chemistry beyond GCSE level? Okay, good. All right. So we'll do it gentle. All right. It'll be the brain in 10 lessons from complete scratch. All right. And all of it. All right. So the ambition, okay, got to be ambitious. The ambition is that at the end of the 10th lesson, you'll all understand how the brain works. Okay. And I assume that you have a very active brain. Okay. All right. So brain. Everybody's seen brains before. You know, they kind of, you know, they're sort of iconic pictures almost. You know, they just look kind of wobbly, don't they? Sort of like a wobbly, porridgey mess. Okay. Brain. Bit like this, okay? You've all sort of seen them before, and if you look at them like this, it doesn't look as if there were many different parts to it, okay? But that's only if you don't look all that carefully. You know, traditionally people think of sort of the brain, of course, the brain kind of grows out of the spinal cord, okay? The spinal cord comes first, for both in evolution and in embryology. The spinal cord is actually the first organ that your body ever grows, all right? And so you basically want to think of the spinal cord as the first part, okay, and then on top of that you then grow a brainstem, and out of the brainstem at the back grows the cerebellum. Okay, the cerebellum is very important really for coordinating movements. It's very good at learning movements. Nowadays people think it may actually do a lot more than that, but that certainly seems to be the most obvious thing. You know, people who are very drunk and staggering and almost falling over behave very much like somebody who's got a big problem with their cerebellum. Okay, so that's because they just don't have this sort of coordination anymore that the cerebellum gives you. So brainstem, cerebellum is linked by the midbrain, which is sort of, you know, shown here sort of in an exaggerated way, and really normally in the brain you wouldn't see the midbrain. It's kind of stuck in here. We'll have more to say about that later. Links it then to the forebrain. The forebrain is made out of a thalamus, which sits in here. Okay, the thalamus is like a relay center that basically then connects this large part that most people think of as the brain, which is the cerebral cortex, to the rest of the brain. Okay, so you can think of this almost like a sort of a hierarchy. The thing at the top is the cerebral cortex. Cortex really just means shell or rind. Okay, so this is the rind, okay, which sits on top of this structure and is linked, you know, through the thalamus. The thalamus can kind of, you know, can gate activity, can allow sort of information to flow up into the cortex or not, and you can kind of switch the cortex off when you go to sleep. Switch it off is actually a highly inaccurate way of putting it. We'll have more to say about that later. So that's the rough structure. Okay, we've got cortex at the top. That's what usually people think of when they talk about the brain. It's the cortex, linked by the midbrain to the brainstem and cerebellum at the back. In this course, we actually won't say a huge amount about the cerebellum. I mean, when I say we do all of the brain, we don't do too much of that unless somebody says, I really want to know everything there's to know about the cerebellum. Cerebellum is very important for medical doctors to know about, because sometimes you get people who have injuries there and then they've got very characteristic motor deficits. But people don't generally think it's sort of the seat of the soul. Okay, sort of things that are interesting, sort of things like addiction, things like love, things like, sort of the interesting problems in neuroscience. Well, actually, no, I'm being a bit partial here. There are lots of interesting things to say about the cerebellum too, but we don't have time for everything. Okay, so cortex. Okay, the cortex, looks like just a sort of a convoluted mess in a way, but there are parts to it, and you'll be able to see that a bit more clearly later. Perhaps the most obvious is that there's a deep fissure running here. Okay, these fissures, if the fissures aren't terribly deep, they're called sulci. All right, this is just a Latin word for them. And the ridges sort of between these little fissures are called the gyri. Okay, so you've got gyri and sulci. All right, and you've got lots of them, and in no two brains are the patterns of gyri and sulci exactly identical, but they're nevertheless very similar from one person to the next. One thing that you can find in pretty much everybody is one big sulcus that runs here along the side, and that really, okay, you can sort of see it here, you can see it here. Oh, well, we'll show it better later. That really sort of cuts the frontal cortex off the parietal cortex. Okay, so we've got frontal, parietal. At the back we've got occipital, all right, so this is right here at the back of the brain. And then here we've got temporal. These are the 4 different lobes, okay, of the cortex. And they do different bits. All right. What they do, we'll learn in the course of, each of them have different roles to play, and we'll have a lot about these roles to say in the future structures. If you were to open one of these things up, then actually, if you imagine you make sort of, you were to cut into the cortex, then you'll see that the cortex, this rind, is really only about 2 millimeters deep in humans, okay? And it's made out of so-called grey matter. It's not really that grey, it's mostly pinkish, actually, if it's sort of fresh and alive. And then below it is the white matter, all right? So the grey matter is full of little nerve cells. Here, sort of, if you look at them under the microscope, they look a bit like this. All right. This is actually a section, a cut through the cerebral cortex, which is stained with a special stain called a Golgi stain, which will fill individual nerve cells with silver. Okay, so little silver granules that form inside them, and that will make these stand out. But the funny thing about the Golgi stain, for reasons that nobody really understands, is that it stains only a tiny fraction of all the nerve cells. Because if you stained all of them, all you'd see is black. Okay, they're so densely packed that you wouldn't see any pattern. Okay, but it's been very useful for actually seeing individual nerve cells here at a huge magnification. So each of these, is only about 20, 30 microns across. Do we know what a micron is? It's a millionth of a meter. Millimeters are thousandths, microns is a millionth of a meter. So about 20 of them is how big they are, and in the whole in the whole of the brain, you've got tens of billions of these individual neurons that all have sort of, funny shapes like this, and things growing out of them. The things that are growing out of them are called the dendrites and the axons, and they form sort of a dense web of connections. All right. Now, so you have these neuron cell bodies concentrated in the grey matter, all right, and then you've got these white matter tracts, and these white matter tracts are really just cables that grow out of these nerve cells, which are known as axons, okay, in the in the proper nomenclature. Okay, lots and lots of axons. So that it's basically as if you had lots and lots of little, all the neurons connected through lots of cables that run through the white matter tract. If you look at the spinal cord, there too you have grey matter, where you've got all the cell bodies, and white matter, where you've got lots and lots of axons connecting these things. Now, I told you that the spinal cord came first in evolution. And sort of the very first, if you think, you imagine you're an incredibly primitive animal, all right? You've just evolved a nervous system. What are the sort of first sort of things that a nervous, that a very primitive animal that can't really do very much other than sort of swim about with a flagellum or something, swims around in a big pond. What you want to do is just, if something pokes you, as a nasty stimulus of some kind, you have a reflex that makes you move in a different direction. Right? And really, these sort of very sort of simple primitive reflex arcs are still very much in our spinal cord. All right, so you've got neurons that are so-called afferent neurons, because they bring information in that come from all over your skin, that connect into the white matter tract of the spinal cord. They connect to cells here in the grey matter, and that allow a flow of information that goes, that brings, information in, like a painful stimulus. You touch a hot plate, all right. Painful stimulus. The information comes into the back, travels into the white matter, connects onto the grey matter neurons, output neurons, and then in the grey matter you then have motor neurons that will activate your muscles and cause you to withdraw. Okay, so you just have a sort of a reflex art set up here. Now, the interesting thing about the spinal cord is that for reasons, is that really all of the sensory information seems to be coming in at the back, and all the motor information seems to be coming out at the front. Okay, you've got so-called dorsal roots, dorsal meaning related to the back, and ventral roots related to the ventrum meaning the belly. All right, coming out at the front. So information goes in at the back, and motor commands come out at the front. And at the end of the day, that's what our brains are for, aren't they? They could be collecting sensory information, and then we decide what to do about it, and we generate movements. And to an extent, the organization, even of the cerebral cortex, which evolved much, much, much later, still has this sort of front-back difference about it. Everything that's posterior to this central sulcus here is almost entirely to do with sensory processing, taking information in, touch information here on the so-called post-central gyrus, visual information here in the occipital cortex, auditory information here at the temporal in the temporal lobes. All of them get sort of combined to help you organize, sort of orient yourself in space, give you, direct your attention to different parts in space and so on. And then here, just in the pre-central gyrus, you have motor cells that will coordinate your movements. Okay, and we'll have a lot more to say about them in later lessons. And then the frontal cortex here, much of it is to do with working memory, decision making, and things like that. We'll also talk about that in great detail. And also so-called limbic things. Okay, when neuroscientists talk about something limbic, they really mean something that's to do with emotion. All right. The word limbic actually just same root as the word limbo in Latin. The limbo is really it's like the purgatory. It's somewhere where you're not quite in heaven and you're not quite in hell. It really means originally border region. And the thing about the limbic structures is that they're all arranged around the edge of the cortex. Okay, and they are really to do with sort of emotional processing. And the orbitofrontal cortex, for example, which sits right here, it's much to do about how appetizing you find something and so on. But maybe also get a chance to talk a little bit about that in later lessons. But you basically, there are exceptions to this rule that sensory information comes in at the back and and then decision making and motor programming comes out at the front. There's one little exception, which is smell, which goes straight into the frontal part. Okay, smell is weird. Okay, now all of this is made out of neurons. Okay, not just neurons. There's also other cells in there. Of course, we need blood supply, so we need to have cells that make blood vessels and blood cells themselves, and we also have cells that they will form little sort of skins and so on, protective skins and stuff. But another important class of cells is the so-called glial cells, from the Latin word for glue, which is just simply cells that are not neurons. Okay, we won't be saying much about glial cells. I mean, they're just they don't seem to be doing any information processing, but they do a variety of things that help keep neurons healthy and happy, and they've got a variety of roles. But we'll have very little to say about them in the course of this thing. Now, even though only about 1 in 5 cells in a brain is a neuron, okay, there are actually more glial cells than there are neurons.